Akhandadhi, thanks you for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much, Tom. Really appreciate the invitation, and looking forward to a great chat with you. Okay, my name is Akhandadhi, obviously not necessarily the original name my parents gave me when I was born some years ago. I'm from Ireland, in Belfast. Grew up as I think you would consider a teenager of the Troubles, the difficult times we had in Belfast in those years. But I think my interest has always been in understanding who I am, the nature of existence, reality, and all of that. And I think in all my years, I've been a sort of consciousness explorer. And that led me to, of course, in the student years, the way we would explore consciousness was with whatever substances were available around. But that only gets you so far. And at a certain point, I wanted to take it really serious. And so nearly 50 years ago it is now that I went and joined an ashram to really try and study consciousness from a kind of yoga meditation perspective. And that's kind of been my journey, exploring the kind of the Eastern approach to consciousness, particularly through the philosophical traditions of Vedanta, which have their kind of other branches in yoga and in Sankhya metaphysics. So over the years, done different things related to that, a lot in education, academics. I've been working with the BBC for 33 years now, doing various pieces for them whenever they need something on Indian and particularly Vedanta philosophy. I managed a retreat centre in lovely area of Wales. Wales is part of the UK, not so known to everyone, but did have a good result last night with the USA in the soccer. So that was a centre which was really an open centre for all types of exploration of ideas in philosophy, science, and personal growth, and exposed me to a lot of additional inputs and ideas which I really appreciated. So I think that's a little bit of my background. Now, tell me, Tom, your background also is in philosophy, is it?
Yeah, I've been working in philosophy, doing debates and conversations for about 5 years. Got into it a little out of high school, actually. So it's been what I've made my living doing for quite a while now. But I'm an atheist, so I don't believe there's any God or spiritual anything, very materialist, physicalist kind of thing. So I think that consciousness is just an emergent property of physical processes in the brain, kind of an argument.
You know what I would say to that? That's so 20th century. So yes. 20th century.
Typically go with
the idea that consciousness is just an emergent property of the brain actually doesn't work anymore. I remember doing a BBC interview. We were doing a little kind of discussion, and I was in the studio with the presenter, and online was a professor from Oxford University. And this is about 15 or more years ago. And he said, oh, of course we know that consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of the brain. And the poor facilitator, I'd never heard this word epiphenomenon. So he kind of looked at me and, tried to say, well, what's all that about? So we had to explain epiphenomenon is just a magical term given to try and say something has happened without any explanation, any causality, any way of or theory behind it. And I think that that's the idea of emergent properties and epiphenomenon we've kind of moved on from that. Things are very different in the last 10 years in the world of neuroscience and consciousness. And I think it's a very interesting field at the moment.
I have researched it quite a bit, and so from the experts I've talked about in neurology, cognitive science, philosophy of mind, most are physicalists still. Most are think it's still
Oh, I think so. I think most remain physicalist of some sort. But the concept of what physicalist means probably has extended quite a bit. And we're not really sure all that it entails. Perhaps, and I'm not saying this is what I kind of particularly adhere to, but I think the biggest buzz in kind of consciousness ideas that is going around the kind of academic circles now is panpsychism. The idea that maybe we can't reduce consciousness to the stuff we already know within physics, but maybe it's physics in another form. Maybe it's another property of physics that we haven't really considered. And that's interesting. But as soon as you really open that box, when you call yourself a physicalist, it's not really clear to how far that's now going to extend. And it may be that we need to invoke kind of a broader picture of reality in order to accommodate the actual functions that we know of consciousness.
But hasn't that always been the physicalist position? Like, I think most people in history who were physicalists always thought we didn't have a complete understanding of reality. There's always been things we didn't know. There's always another law of physics or something beneath the ones we know about. So I don't see that as a particularly surprising position or off-brand for physicalists. But I think that position is still preferable to, say, idealism or dualism, where you're saying there is an entirely new ontology out there. That seems much more spectacular than just to say that there's another physical process we haven't found out about.
Well, I haven't promoted idealism or dualism. And again, this is something that, see, the Western kind of philosophy has really backed itself into a corner on discussing consciousness, because it really seems to have produced a dichotomy, or at least a trichotomy of either you're a physicalist, or you're a dualist, or you're an idealist. And the Vedanta picture really wouldn't look at it like that. And I think the first thing to do is to consider that what are the functions we are talking about when we discuss consciousness? And what are the functions of mental states and the properties of mental states? And the way Vedanta would look at it is that these seem to be different categorizations of functions and properties. We can put aside the ontology for now, because actually science doesn't tell us about ontology. It doesn't tell us about what things are composed of. It analyzes everything in terms of what it does and what it looks like, i.e. what its functions are and what its properties are. That's how we break down physics. We end up with subatomic particles, which we define, well, these have these properties, and this is what they do, is how they interact. So that's how we analyze everything. So let's analyze consciousness in the same objective way, without getting tied up with, does it fit into my metaphysical kind of concepts of being a theist, an atheist, a physicalist, a dualist, or whatever. I think that is really spoiling the discussion in Western circles. So my kind of mission, if you like, in discussions of these sorts amongst academics and others, is to try and kind of make scientists, or help scientists think more philosophically, and to help the philosophers think more scientifically about these aspects.
So I'd agree that science doesn't directly tell us about ontology. It's all about interactions and relations, so it can't tell us necessarily what things are made of. But I don't see how that is a separate question of like physicalism, dualism, idealism. I think that there's like a logical entailment there that either consciousness comes from an emergent property of the brain, or it comes from some force that's greater than the brain, something in the universe of some kind. And either that force is fundamental or it's another kind of ontology altogether. And so I think those do encapsulate all of the major possibilities: physicalism, dualism, idealism. Um,
Well,
and
perhaps we can give you another during this chat, but carry on,
sure,
sorry.
sure. Well, so I think that of the three positions, the ones that seem to be the most supported is physicalism, because all of our evidence seems to indicate that consciousness comes from brains. When we mess with brains, we mess with consciousness, and there doesn't seem to be any other way to mess with consciousness. You can't mess with anything else other than brains to mess with consciousness.
Well,
And
I think your evidence could be challenged.
sure,
I don't think there is any direct evidence that consciousness is a product of the brain. There's certainly correlation between certain brain activity and what we report as conscious states. But the big problem that has never been dealt with by any of the neuroscientists, and there isn't even a theory on it now, are in the hard problems of qualia. And that still requires, if one is going to have an explanation or a postulation, or certainly an assurance that consciousness is a product of the brain, then one needs to have some account of how the brain could possibly provide us two things. One is the qualitative experiences that we call qualia, and second is that subjective experiencer experience of being aware of those qualities. And I think John Searle summed it up right, and I don't agree with him on other things, but I think he was spot on when he said any account of consciousness has to account for what he called unified qualitative subjectivity. So those aspects are still the hard problem of consciousness. And I don't think there is anyone in the field of neuroscience who thinks that they've got that cracked yet.
well, I would agree, but I don't think there's any alternatives that have it cracked either. So I think that no one solved that problem, but
Now,
using
this
induction, I think physicalism is probably the best bet.
There's no harm in you having your favorite. There's nothing wrong. We all have our favorites in different ways, which is why I wanted to kind of study consciousness from a first person point of view. Now, the empiric method of science, if you look at kind of philosophy of science, is that it is very good at trying to analyze that which we kind of cast our gaze on and which we break down from a third party perspective. And it's brilliant at that, and it's designed for that. And it's, the results of that system are just stupendous. But it does struggle, and this is the admission, that when that process, that third-party process, is applied to analyzing the world, when we look at it through our modeling in physics, we find no place to account for the very thing that is doing the observing, us as conscious beings. And we can say, okay, it must be in the brain, but that's so simplistic. I'm afraid that's a very simplistic kind of way of looking at it. And really, if before we kind of just jump to making an assumption, why don't we spend more effort on the actual, a different type of scientific analysis, that which delves into consciousness directly? And that's the whole process of the yoga system. It is actually meant through internal focus to try and at least do this much: clarify, what do we mean by myself as a conscious being? What is going on with me consciously? And what am I experiencing consciously? And how does that relate then to the world? So I'm not in favor of just kind of claiming dichotomies and differences of opinion and things. I think we can work together to look at consciousness from both directions, and that might help illuminate the question better for us.
I think my initial concern would be is that the reason science stopped looking at introspection as a valid way to gain data is because of how many problems it has. There's tens of thousands of fallacies, biases, illusions, delusions, misconceptions, weighted thinking, all kinds of things that make our intuitive understandings very flawed. And the whole point of science is to filter those things out, to leave us with only the reliable ways of knowing. And it seems like what you're saying would open the door to those things and not have a way to differentiate the part that's just a figment of our imagination with reality. And so,
well, let's just step back a moment. You're making very good points, and you're right. That's the scientific method has avoided those, particularly in its view of the outside. But we can't ignore our own intuitions. We each feel, I exist. We know I exist. I exist. I know I do. I experience stuff. I feel stuff. I have reason to believe I exist. That is an intuition. It's not something that science can prove to me. So therefore, I'm willing to accept something that science can't prove to me. That's the one thing, at least that much, I'm willing to accept. I am the witness of my thoughts. I am the witness of the actions of my body. That is my daily experience. So those are intuitions which I think are relevant, and I think they're valid, and I think they're starting points for the exploration. Now, you're quite right. How do we then carry out this exploration without all those other biases, filters, and illusions stepping in? And you're quite right. Any individual, we're all susceptible to that. So there needs to be at least a similar type of weeding out that we use for our external science needs to be there with the internal science. And that, again, is part of the rigor of certain types of yoga. That it's trying to look at what is actually happening and using the standard system of, well, what works for me, can it be replicated in you? Can you replicate the experiment? And when we get together with a team of experts, is there peer review of those experiences, and do they tally, together? So I'm not saying it's a perfect system, but there at least is opportunities to develop. And I think by doing that, there's a certain clarity that comes, that when we talk about our experience of the world, we've kind of got three baskets of stuff, or baskets of functions. We have the basket of physical functions, but we've also got the basket of mental functions, all the mental states and things. Now, how are you on qualia?
I agree with pretty much everything you said there, though I don't think the cogito is like intuition. So I agree qualia exists. There is something that it's like to be me. There is consciousness does exist. I don't think it's just an illusion. So not a Ian. I think that there is physical stuff, but I don't see a reason to think that it's a separate kind of anything.
Well, let's just say never kind of anything, as let's just talk about its properties, the properties of qualia. Now, the standard one, redness of red, that when I look at the world and looking around, I haven't got anything red around me to point at, but light enters our eyes. Now, light is not colored. Light is just various wavelengths. And it sets off one of three types of cones in our eyes, in our retina. And if a particular wavelength, say the one that we associate with red, around the 650, 700 nanometers, etc., will set off one particular type of cone, that sets off a little signal beep going to my head. So my brain has got that electrical signal. But my experience of it is of redness. That redness has a quality of redness that doesn't appear to be available in the electrical data of the brain. Certainly not in that format. And that's why qualia are a problem.
I don't
Because
understand.
we experience something that we cannot, with properties that we cannot place or find an explanation for within the neurology of the brain.
Well, isn't that the same of literally everything that we've ever discovered throughout human history? Like, we couldn't understand, even if we had all of the facts about hydrogen and oxygen, we wouldn't understand wetness because we were missing the electromagnetic force. So until we discovered the electromagnetic force, we'd never be able to understand wetness or why wetness is there. It's completely mysterious. Same with electricity, same with clouds, same with earthquakes. If we're missing a single piece of data, we would be unable to explain what's going on there. And it doesn't seem to me like qualia would be any different. There just could be this extra law of physics out there that correlates electrical activity to create consciousness, and we just are missing it. And so I don't understand why simply the fact that we aren't able to do that right now would be any different than looking at lightning 2,000 years ago or water 2,000 years ago and saying, well, we can't explain it right now with our limited knowledge, therefore it must be this special thing that is completely outside of the realms of what we know about.
And that, again, is an article of faith in terms of qualia. There may be certain differences because at least with water and why it happens, it's a fairly straightforward system. But in terms of qualia, we've got a problem on it. And what I think is the correct approach is at least pop it into a different category that needs clarification. I'm not saying that it is impossible for some discovery in the future to be able to link it with brain activity. But at the moment, we haven't got that. So at least let's be clear that it's a different category that needs clarification. And
Sure.
Myself as the observer, the subjective viewer of that also needs a different category of thought and function, because that's a different property. I am not just my experiences, I am the experiencer of those experiences. So that puts it, gives us a kind of a set of three things that we need to deal with if we are going to account for my experience of the world.
What is the difference there between the experiences and the experiencer? Because those seem to be the same thing to me.
No, I experience this moment passes, a new moment comes, I experience that. But I remain the experiencer of both those moments, in fact, all the moments. So I'm kind of trans moment, if you like. I'm going across all these moments and experiencing each of them individually, separately, but as the same experiencer. Now, each time I have an experience, I may be moved by it, I may be impressed by it, I may even internalize it to make my way of thinking and experiencing and even my personality change. But that doesn't mean I am a different entity having the experience. And through the processes of meditation, this distinction between myself as the observer and that which I am observing within my mind, in terms of thoughts, emotions, ideas, sensations, and all of those things, becomes very clear. And that's a key element of even early stage meditation.
What exactly do you mean by that? Because when I see any kind of experience must have an experiencer, or it's not an experience.
That's true.
And so for there to be a person who has experiences, there must also be experiences. So for there to be an experiencer, they must have experiences to experience. Otherwise, there is no experiencer either, because they're not experiencing anything. And so
No,
it seems
that's like saying, at the moment I'm experiencing what's on this computer screen. So yes, I am the experience of the computer screen. Just before we came online, that screen went dead. So you could say I'm not experiencing anything on the screen anymore, but my ability to experience continues. So even during periods when we are not experiencing the world, and we know that happens even in deep sleep, it's meant to happen during anesthesia, and in other kind of circumstances, what we're experiencing is switched off, but we retain the ability to wake up the next morning and I am still the same experiencer, ready for more action. So I think, and as I say, that through the meditative process, I think you've got a really good opportunity to explore that kind of little distinction there, because it's very helpful. Because in one sense, what that suggests is that time is working on all the rest of the stuff.
Well, what that would suggest to me is that consciousness isn't fundamental, that there's something else that is governing consciousness, and that something else can turn it on and turn it off in certain contexts. And what is doing that seems to be best explained by biology, brains. Because if the brain was a conduit and was only picking up data, we wouldn't necessarily expect it to shut off consciousness when we sleep. The consciousness would still be there, and it would just not be connected to the brain or something along those lines. But that's not exactly what we see. We see the consciousness goes away. It's gone. Poof. Like the screen going off in many cases. Sometimes we have dreams, but that also seems to be explained by the brain. And so...
Yeah, dream is another state where the mind is continually active and picking up stuff from the brain and certain sensory things, but going over memories and all sorts of other transactions. So that also gives us something to experience in those states. But within the connection between consciousness and the physicality, it depends what you want to experience. It's the example I gave is where we're experiencing what's on our screen. If the screen goes blank, yeah, then if I'm allowing my dependency on experience to be something external, then you're right. It is controlled, or at least influenced by those external circumstances of physicality of the brain and the body. But that doesn't mean that brain and the body are the sources of consciousness.
Right, but the first thing I wanted to touch on the first thing you said.
Huh?
I wanted to touch on the first thing you said, where because we know that consciousness can shut off during sleep, that means that it has to be governed by something external, right? Because there's clearly different states of consciousness when you're awake and when you're not awake. And when you're not awake, you may not be experiencing any conscious experiences, but you still have the potential to become awake later, which means that the consciousness doesn't seem to be able to be fundamental. There has to be something else controlling it, like a on-off switch on a TV or like a pipe or something. And that seems to indicate to me that a good reason to not believe consciousness is special.
I think it's a good reason to believe that when we allow our consciousness to be dependent on and this is how the Vedanta looks at it, that we allow our consciousness to be dependent, if you like, on the mechanisms of both the body and of the mind, then at times those things will switch off their service to us. It's like the internet going down. It's like our screens going blank. But actually, when through meditation one begins to understand that even in deep sleep, you are never actually non-conscious. You may not be conscious of the external world. You may not be even conscious of your mind being active. But it is not that you are non-conscious. And this is the kind of insight that meditation can provide, that it is possible to be conscious of consciousness itself. That is kind of one of the goals and one of the, I think, one of the insights that that process can give us. Now, it's a hard one to explain to those who haven't undergone it, but it's not something that anyone can't do if they wish for themselves.
Well, what does that mean? Because I think like I wasn't conscious before I was born. I'm not conscious when I go into very deep non-REM sleep or REM sleep. I forget which one. I don't imagine I'm going to be conscious when I die. Why think that there's some level of consciousness in those states of existence?
Because one can experience them. Because that's the point. If we don't engage with our own consciousness in a research way, we might not get to know what its potential is all about.
Well,
So
how do you meditate and experience what it was like before you were born?
what you can do is meditate on the nature of being conscious without having something conscious to be conscious of other than oneself. That's the challenge, and that is the possibility. Now, I'm not saying that that explains all the points you're trying to make about what is before birth. We certainly know consciousness exists before birth. At what point it manifests within the embryo is, of course, a whole debate in itself, but it certainly can be demonstrated to be there. Does consciousness extend after death? Well, my take on it is that consciousness is not dependent on the brain or on the mind in order for its existence. That's my kind of take on all the work I've done over all these years. And therefore, I'm open to the idea that consciousness is not dependent on just the physicality and my association of my consciousness with this body. That there may be opportunities for consciousness to continue to exist in some other situation, in some other format.
Well, how would you get to the point where you can experience something without a brain? Because that's the part I'm struggling with when you said you could reflect on consciousness and be aware of consciousness without there being anything to experience other than the experiencer. Uh, what in what way does that show that you can be conscious without a brain?
I think that there's been plenty of studies, particularly through AWARE and others researching persons who have flat lines in their brain activity, but still have demonstrated conscious awareness at those particular times, correlated with them. And that certainly just gives us pause to think that maybe consciousness isn't dependent on the electrical activity of the brain.
I'm pretty familiar with those cases, the NDEs, near-death experiences, but those seem fully explained by brain function. So, for example, one of the common ones is when someone goes into cardiac arrest, their heart stops. The doctors will do things to them or talk about things around them, and they'll be able to recall what the doctor did or said. And that's very easily explained because when someone dies, the brain is still functioning. The cells, the ATP in the cells is still firing. Your heart isn't contingent on your brain functioning. Electrical signals are still going out through your body. And so you don't need an EEG signal in your brain for your brain to function. It's still doing stuff whether you're aware of it or not. The EEG is more just what is required for there to be a conscious state. And so the fact that when you suddenly lose consciousness, the wiring in your brain is kind of like water pipes that randomly get shut off. They're all open in the exact same ways they were open prior to it being suddenly shut off. And so if you go into cardiac arrest in a conscious state, all of the electrical signals that are going to your brain will be saved as a conscious memory. So when you hear sounds, they will vibrate your eardrums just like they did before your when you were awake, and those vibrations in the eardrums will translate electrical signals to the brain, and those electrical signals to the brain will be sent to memories. And all of that can happen without a heartbeat. You don't need a heartbeat. You don't need an EEG for any of that. That's just basic electrical signals of ATP and cells firing.
I'm not sure that it's as straightforward as that, because the brain relies on its energy supply is provided in the oxygen in the blood. The cells, neurons are different to or other cells which have their own energy systems, but brain cells don't. And therefore, without the heart, within a very short time, 20, 30 seconds, the systems that you're describing will shut down. And therefore, they will not be operating in that way in order to provide the sense of experience that that person has. And then you kind of got an additional problem that if a brain in that sort of very low, even if you say minimal electrical state, is able to be correlated with actual aware consciousness. And some of the descriptions, I'm remembering one of my friends who had a very interesting out-of-body experience during a hernia operation, described the clarity of the activities that he was witnessing, and it was a fully conscious state which he was able to describe thereafter. It wasn't just something vague and memorized and something that he didn't feel he'd been through. So I don't think your explanation quite ties up. But
well let me touch on that a little bit. So ATP is stored in the cells, and if you suddenly shut down, the cells won't fire or don't have a reason to fire. And so they're going to wait for an input to fire. And so they're just primed for something to cause them to fire. And once they fire, then the ATP will be used. And so if you suddenly lose consciousness and there's nothing causing them to fire, then they're just going to sit there and wait. There's wait for input. And then if you get an input through hearing something, seeing something, some powerful input, they will then fire. Now, there's a limited amount they can do this. So you're right that they can only do this for about 30 seconds to a minute, and then they're going to run out of energy. But
exactly, and so it's the correlation of what happens after that point that I think is the significant factor.
Well, the after the point is what I'm getting to here. When it starts is arbitrary. When it starts to fire, when it starts to send a signal, there has to be some kind of an input to cause that. It doesn't immediately, all of the cells in your body don't immediately emit ATP 1 minute after you lose heart. It doesn't happen that way. There's tons of it stored in your body for hours after you lose consciousness. What matters is when that gets released. And so if something can cause your brain to cascade and cause cells to release it in a pattern, like hearing something in your auditory sensors, which fire your Broca's sensor of your brain, which then causes all of these things and these ATP in these neurons to fire. That can cause whatever you experience to be saved as memory at whatever time that happened. And that the same thing can happen for visual sensations or touch sensations, and they can be different or they could be at the same time. And so you can have a broad swath of memories that you get from different brain or different neurons in your brain firing ATP at different times to build a conglomeration of a memory there without any new ATP. You don't need any new ATP because it's all, you have trillions of, or 100 billion cells in your brain, 100 billion neurons, and they all have ATP in them. And so as long as you have enough random coincidental firings, you can continue to build memories without any consciousness whatsoever for a very long time. It doesn't need to be replenished.
I think you've extended a little analysis on ATP to give it a lot more power than most researchers and neuroscientists are willing to do on that one. But we'll agree to disagree that it has the potency. And also I would, there is a difference between when I have an experience of something and I recall that experience. It isn't just pulling out a file of something that I haven't been through before. It isn't like that. It's a different type of sense of experience.
What do you mean? Because false memories are a thing where people literally think they had an experience they just didn't have.
Yeah, false memories, but that's a different type of thing. That's uh, I think that's looking at something that where I put real experiences together to get a wrong answer. You
What?
know?
So like
Um,
one of the examples of false memory was there was a woman, she was watching TV of a famous actor. She fell asleep, and when she woke up, she had thought she had been sexually assaulted by this actor. She's never been in person with this guy. She just saw him on TV. So she wasn't like recalling actual things that happened. She literally just made it up and thought it was a real thing.
she was recalling different things and putting them together to get the wrong answer. She was recalling this actor. She must have been recalling maybe some other trauma that either she had witnessed or gone through, and then putting them together like that. And that, yeah, good example of a false memory.
But so why couldn't your experiences of consciousness or near-death experiences be the exact same thing?
One of the tests that is used to try and corroborate what someone has experienced is to ask them afterwards about the resuscitation process and to ask them what did they know about what was going on to them prior to their heart being reactivated. And those who have claimed to have experiences during that flatlined period are able to give an interesting and an accurate description of that. And those who wake up and say they have no memories are also given the same test. Can you tell how you were resuscitated? And they'll just say something according to what they saw on Casualty or whatever, stand by, boom, and no, it wasn't like that at all. So I think that helps to at least give some credence to the fact that what they were experiencing was their memory and was their the experience of what was going on, because it's
I'm
a
not
recall.
I'm not following exactly, because that can all be explained by the process that is well known in neurology of what I've described, which is that the ATP is stored in the cell if it's not being used. If you
You're
have
giving
some
too
kind
much.
of
You're giving too much credit to
well, this
that.
is just a fact in neurology. ATP can be stored in the cells for hours if it's not being used. And
It's
so
it's
it's
we're
not
not
like I think your argument is contingent on the fact that once you lose your heart, every single cell in your brain loses ATP in several minutes. And that's false. That is 100% false.
I wasn't saying that, but they're certainly not activated to the point where we could say, oh, that is enough brain activity to account for consciousness.
Oh, no. So I agree there. There is no consciousness. I'm saying there is no consciousness in the brain at this time. What it's doing is it's causing a
And,
what your brain does to
and
save
I'm
memories.
saying that there's no consciousness does not correlate to the way these testimonies explain their experience. They account that I was conscious during this. It's like I am
Well, no,
conscious
that's the thing.
during.
That's the thing I'm trying to explain. So you can have your brain cause
No,
completely.
you can say that there's memories. You
Right.
can say that there must be something that will stimulate and could be recalled as a memory, but it's not clear how you're tying that with the conscious experience
Right.
of the person.
That was the part I was explaining first. So when your brain shuts off randomly, every sensation you're having is being saved to as a conscious memory. So something you recall as you being awake when this happened. When you're asleep, it's saved to a different part of memory that is not this is something you experienced while you were awake. And so when your brain shuts off due to cardiac arrest, all of the wires in your brain are set to have any experience you have be saved to that same place where you save this is something that happened while I was awake. And so anything that you experience is going to be put into that box of you're going to remember it as you were awake when you experienced this, whether it's there or not. So if I took an electrode and zapped a few neurons in your brain and caused you to think of Jennifer Aniston, like the Jennifer Aniston neuron. But this was not enough. But it was not enough to cause you to actually have the experience. So there's not enough electrical activity to generate consciousness. When you wake up, you will remember having consciously experienced Jennifer Aniston, even though it never happened. There was no conscious experience there whatsoever. But because I fired that neuron and the ATP in that neuron caused a chain reaction to cause it to be saved to your conscious memory, you will remember that experience even though it never happened.
All right. We'll disagree on the power of that process. I think there is a system that's there, and I think that's well documented. But I have never read that anyone thinks that that is sufficient to explain all the phenomenon that is happening on that one. But we can let's move on to how Vedanta regards the interaction of consciousness and mind and the world around, because that's something I actually do want to explore with you.
Sure.
The analogy that best suits it actually is a modern analogy. There are various kind of older versions mentioned in various texts of the past. But really what we're looking at is the experience we might have within some kind of virtual reality simulation, or particularly one of these kind of massively multiplayer, online role-playing games. And in one sense,
I'm familiar with that.
I'm sure you're familiar with that. So I thought that might be at least a little bit of a connection. And that's actually the analogy, or at least that is a very good metaphor for how consciousness interacts with the world. That we enter these, that the world is really one of just these big multiplayer games in which consciousness adopts a role based on its avatar of the body and the mind, and interacts with other bodies and minds around. And in that way, it is possible to postulate the happy interaction of consciousness, through that system.
Okay, so I think I partially understand the model. What I'm missing is the evidence to justify the model. And why wouldn't that fit into the labels of idealism or dualism?
Well, idealism kind of says that the world really is only experienced in our mind, therefore perhaps only the mind exists, and that our mental kind of impressions of the world aren't grounded in anything more in reality. I don't subscribe to that. Vedanta takes a different view. It takes a lot of reality to create the illusions that we might experience of the world in our mind, but we are having real experiences, and our real experiences aren't always veridical about the world, but they are grounded in the world, they are correlated with the world. Otherwise, we wouldn't be getting on as well as we're getting on. So, not in favor of the kind of idealism. And the dualism is, well, is consciousness something completely different? Well, obviously it's not completely different. Consciousness can't be completely different from mind because it interacts happily. Mind interacts very well with the world, gathers all the information about it. So qualia, interacts with the brain and the body and all the senses and what it gathers. But so what are they made of? Well, they're all made from the same stuff. But the question is that stuff what is that stuff, you could say, that can give rise to the diverse properties of physics, of mind, and of consciousness? That's really the question. And so it's just a question, how big is your box? And maybe that big box, you might say, well, that's going to be all physical. Or maybe it's all mental to someone else. I think that big
or
box,
a combination of both.
or a combination of both, of course, because it'll have both the properties. It obviously, physics properties are real, my mental properties, qualia, are real. Consciousness is a real function, so they all exist, and so there may be something that ties them all together. So how big is your box going to be?
Well,
so in that perspective,
how is that a different option? So it seems like the options are all physical, all mental, combination of both. It's physicalism, idealism, dualism. And even if there was something that there's
there's a oneness here in how everything is connected and from which everything comes. So that is a oneness, but there's also obviously a clear diversity within the manifestation of the properties. So we have a philosophy here of simultaneous oneness and difference, which sounds a contradiction, but it's more along the lines of a kind of oxymoron, that by stressing the simultaneous oneness and difference of everything, you've kind of got a way of at least understanding their happy interaction whilst manifesting diverse properties.
So I'm not seeing, like, so you're saying they are different things, but there's a like physicalism and idealism, or physicalism and consciousness are two existing things, but there's another thing behind them that creates both, or something?
I'm saying that they're both part of a bigger picture. In Vedanta, that is known as Brahman, the energy which is the totality and has the ability to manifest itself in various functions. So that would include all the functions of physical existence. It would include the mind, and it would include consciousness.
So why posit an entirely new ontological entity that grounds both of these things? That seems like it's very excessive. Like, we could say there's like magical leprechauns or something, and magical leprechauns created both. But why? What is the purpose of adding in this new ontology?
We're saying that consciousness is part of Brahman.
Yeah.
The physicalism is a specific manifestation of Brahman. And we know that we're trying to kind of get to the grounding of physics. And, we've got a long way down, we think, but we've got no idea how far further we've got to go. And at a certain point, we're going to see maybe a substrate that does link mind and physics together. And maybe by digging even further, we're going to find a substrate that links the functions of consciousness, mind, and physics. Now, I understand from your point of view, you think, well, that deepest substrate which will tie them all together will still be physical. My take on it is that it will be conscious. That's our difference. The ultimate source from which all these other properties come. Is it conscious or is it non-conscious? That becomes the kind of choice that I think any human being can make on this particular point. Now, it's not a question of idealism, dualism, or physical. It's just a question of what you regard as the nature of that absolute substrate which ties everything together.
Isn't that the same thing? So, like, asking what is the nature of the substrate, whether it's conscious, that's idealism, or is it physical, that's
No,
physicalism?
it's not. No. It's not. Say that the substrate is conscious isn't idealism, because that's saying that the idealism is tainted with its idea that the physical world doesn't exist. And we're not saying that.
So is Brahman fully consciousness, or is he consciousness and also physical stuff?
It's consciousness that can manifest as non-physical stuff as well as all other functions. It's Brahman, which is the full picture of it. It's a substrate. It's a substrate which can produce all the other stuff, all the other functions.
And it's conscious.
Yeah.
Consciousness is what it is fundamentally.
It's fundamentally conscious. Now that's the picture.
Sounds a lot like idealism.
Huh?
Sounds a lot like idealism.
It's not idealism, but no. Don't try and put a label to it. It's Vedanta. It's not. A lot of people do interpret Vedanta as kind of idealism, because they say that you're just saying consciousness exists, therefore physical world doesn't exist. No, we're not saying that.
Well, so
consciousness is pretty hot stuff, I think, and I would regard consciousness as being, I think it's the prime mover within this triumvirate, if you like, of physics, mind, and consciousness. I think it's the prime mover ultimately. And that's what we try to do through the exploration of the yoga system, to try and understand that what is the nature of me, the experiencer. And the nature of me, the experiencer, does not seem to be tied simply to this body, nor to the mind. And when I delve into it, it is possible to start experiencing consciousness as part of that conscious totality that is kind of is the substrate.
So I understand your model, but I still don't understand why we would posit Brahman. Why would we need to posit Brahman, or this third entity, to explain anything?
If you're going to posit that we can at some point link physics with mind and with consciousness, you're going to have to get down to something that works. And in the world of consciousness, at the moment, no one is exploring ideas of, I won't say no one, the majority of thinkers do not believe that they're going to find it simply by brain activity. Hence, the big ideas are in information integration, which, although is a kind of information processing model, actually is drawing on kind of links with panpsychism. And the other big one, of course, is Hameroff's and Penrose's orchestrated objective reduction, which looks at really quantum activity producing experiences, but doesn't provide a sense of the experiencer or of qualia. And I've had some good arguments with Stuart Hameroff on that one.
Well, the part I'm missing is that why do we need Brahman or any of these new third things? It seems like we can explain that.
What is the source then of everything that exists? Where does that come from?
Quantum fields.
Oh, do you not think there's something beyond quantum fields?
No.
No?
There might be, but I think that the best explanation is quantum fields, and there's no evidence to posit anything greater than that.
No.
So, like, if I was to go beyond, if I was to say that there was something beyond quantum fields, there would be equally as much evidence for that as there was for leprechauns created quantum fields. And so I think there's no evidence to go beyond.
Okay, I take your point, and I think that's very appropriate, that you don't want to go beyond quantum fields in terms of what can be demonstrated. So within quantum fields, can we explain all of reality, including mind and consciousness?
The known ones, no, but possibly we don't know of all of them, so
No,
it's
we don't
possible.
know. No, so we're going to have to go deeper and deeper and deeper. And so at some point, you have to postulate that there is some kind of substrate. All right, we may not be able to give it a name at this stage, or you may not want to identify it, but it's at least philosophically feasible to postulate a source from which all reality comes.
Well,
That's
sure, but
a
I think
philosophical position.
I think it's more reasonable to always use combinations of known things than to add in asserted things. So discovered properties are always better than asserted properties. And so if you want to say there is another quantum
No,
field, that is
but
more reasonable than to say there is a thing that created all quantum fields. So it seems more reasonable to say there is an expansion of known kinds of things rather than to say there is a completely new kind of thing that has no other analogous basis.
yeah, but you don't have to torture yourself quite so badly in philosophy on that one. I think that you can at least understand that whatever I'm looking at, and particularly when I'm looking at it through the lens of physics and its quantitative process, I can only be looking at manifest properties. And therefore, I have to consider that what is giving rise to these properties. And I may not be able to go there yet, but you may not be able to delve further than that. But then the question is, if it is, if that source was conscious in some way, then is it possible for my consciousness to link with the source of reality? And that's then the question that comes up through the yoga system. The idea of relational yoga, that my consciousness can link with other consciousnesses better than we are maybe just chatting here today, because we're not doing that directly. We're doing that not just via the medium of electronics, we're also doing it via the media of me speaking in this body, you hearing it in your body, you processing it with your mind, and we going back and forth. But consciousness has the ability to directly relate consciousness to consciousness. And that is, again, a type of experience that can be explored and developed through the yoga system. So what we're suggesting really is that explore the material world as far as you like with physics. It's great. There's nothing wrong with that enterprise. Very happy about it. And we'll all kind of enjoy the benefits. But at the same time, it is a whole opportunity to explore the link of consciousness with this world and to explore the link of consciousness with a potential of the source as consciousness. And that's one that actually has given me a lot of fun and a lot of pleasure and a lot of personal insights. So I'm kind of attached to it for myself, and I would at least recommend it as, for those who are open to wanting to explore reality as much as they personally can. Don't just switch yourself off thinking, well, we don't have to worry about consciousness. I can't think about it because I can't analyze it without my intuitions leading me astray. No, you can do better than that. You can get into it.
Gotcha. We do have a few questions from Winston's mom specifically. Winston's mom asks, what nakshatra rules his lunar mansion?
The nakshatra is a particular star which would be sitting in my in the horoscope, and I have never done my horoscope. No idea. I wish I could answer. You've got no idea whatsoever. It sounds like your questioner probably has a better understanding and has already pegged me as a particular nakshatra.
All right. And she also asks, are you familiar with Robert Thurman and Menla House?
No, I can't say that. Would she like to kind of offer a little bit more on what they're involved with?
We can wait and see if there's more messages that pop up.
Not doing well so far on these questions.
All right, I think those are actually it for the questions so far. But we have been going for about an hour. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you going on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
All right. Well, really, the only thing that's kind of easily available is some video lectures I gave on consciousness and giving a kind of metaphysical picture that if we took consciousness seriously and if it was its own thing and if it was distinctive in its properties and functions from physics, would that give us a new insight into what we could explore within science, particularly biology, physics, and even cosmology? So that video series is available on YouTube. And just tap in Atma Paradigm. Atma is ATMA Paradigm. And thank you very much.
Yep. Winston's mom said Robert Thurman is a professor of Indo-Tibetan Buddhist studies at Columbia University, and as well as the co-founder of the president of Tibet House US, Minla, in service of H. Dalai Lama and people of Tibet.
Well, thank you, Winston's mom. Sorry, no, I haven't. I'm not that familiar with the work.
All right, cool. Well, thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Really enjoyed chatting with you. All the best to your work and your own research and exploration of life, existence, love, and beyond.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks again for coming on, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.